Our final video for today looks at the important notion of transition and emerging economies. Now, as you can see here, transition economies may be loosely defined as those which have been characterized by a move towards greater democracy and even more importantly, towards greater economic liberalisation. And they tend to often be from more centrally planned economic systems towards a more market-based system. So we see some prominent examples here: the BRICS nations, some African states, a number of the former USSR countries, and also the Central Asian republics. Certainly, a lot of the time when people think of countries like Kazakhstan, the first thing that comes into their mind is this particular character, but it's actually quite misleading. Certainly the way that the country was portrayed in that particular movie. If anybody's been to Kazakhstan recently, and certainly its capital city, which we see here, Astana, it's very, very much, as you can see from the photo, quite a modern city today, and characterised by much higher levels of development than was portrayed in that particular movie. So that's a great example of how quickly and dramatically a lot of these nations can move from being very much a developing nation much closer towards developed. And speaking of which, this is basically what we're talking about when we discuss emerging economies. That is, as it says there, those economies that are moving from developing to developed. So there's often a fair bit of overlap between the terms emerging and transition economies, and a number of authors will use them interchangeably, but there is a slight difference there that's important to understand. In terms of why we're seeing this big push towards transition, or the transition of so many of these major economies, there are a couple of factors here. There are certainly a number of benefits that we see with transition, so much so that they made a terrible romantic comedy about it, or something along those lines anyway. One of the main reasons is because of the spread of democracy. So what we've tended to find is that over the last few decades, a lot of the major totalitarian regimes around the world simply just haven't been able to deliver on their promises with regards to things like economic progress. And in fact, the opposite has occurred. What we've tended to find is that the gap between the more wealthier democratic-based nations and the communist or socialist nations has actually been widening, as there's been that stagnation amongst the more centrally planned-based nations. We've also seen dramatic advances in technology with regards to telecommunications and things like the internet, which has made it much more difficult for things like propaganda to be spread within the traditional centrally planned nations, which typically has illustrated the limitations associated with democracy. As this information regarding the success of a lot of the democratic-based nations has become much more prominent and available to those people in the traditionally centrally planned nations, so has their awareness and their sort of push towards a more market-based system that has occurred. We've also typically seen a significant increase in the middle class in a lot of these transition economies, and what we tend to typically see is that most of the time when there is an increase in the middle class, these people are looking to become more and more affluent, and as a consequence they typically push for more democratic reforms. That is, they prefer and are looking for additional ways to increase their own wealth, and as we've talked about previously, that's most commonly achieved through democratic means. So when you combine these factors, we've seen a significant spread across democracy, which has certainly pushed the greater movement towards a lot of these transition economies. At the same time, there's also been evidence to suggest that many of the command and mixed economies have generally failed to deliver sustained economic performance that has been achieved by many of the market-based nations. So you've got this combination of the failure of the totalitarian political systems and a lot of the command and mixed economic systems, while at the same time the success of a lot of the democratic nations in terms of that political system and the market-based systems from an economics perspective. And when combined, this is what's been a driving force, or two driving forces behind this push with a lot of these transition economies. Now, if you are aiming to transition from that more traditional centrally planned system towards a market-based system, there are a number of things which need to be in place. And the first of these is deregulation, which typically involves removing legal restrictions to the free play of markets and the establishment of private enterprises, and the way in which those private enterprises are able to operate. So there needs to be the ability for the market system to actually play itself out, and that is for things like the forces of supply and demand to actually operate free from interference from the government. In line with this, there's also typically increased levels of privatisation that needs to occur. That is the transfer of ownership of state property into the hands of private investors. As we've discussed in previous videos, a lot of the time we see dramatic increases in things like profit generation and also efficiency when the ownership of a particular enterprise is transferred from state into private hands. So this has certainly been a key sort of construct associated with a lot of these transition economies as well. Finally, in terms of the legal system, there needs to be that protection for individuals and indeed companies' intellectual property and their property rights. The whole point of transition economies is to try and enable people and firms to generate greater levels of profit and increase efficiency and so on. And they're not going to be able to do that, at least not to their greatest potential, if they're not able to make the money that they deserve to make from their property and their intellectual property. And that needs to be, in order for that to happen, there needs to be that legal protection there, so that if somebody does steal it or try to make money that they don't deserve to be making from somebody else's intellectual property, there is cause for omission there, and basically protecting the rights of those people who rightfully own that property. Just to summarise here, we mentioned on the first slide for this video that one of the major groups within the transition economies that are often cited as a good example are the BRICS nations. Now, when we talk about BRICS nations, we're not talking about these BRICS, and for anyone who's seen Team America, we're certainly not talking about our friend Hans Blix. We are talking about the BRICS nations, which comprise, as you can see, of Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. And they're certainly 5 of the largest emerging or newly industrialized economies around the globe at the moment. All of the BRICS members have demonstrated large and fast-growing economies. It's been quite a rapid development in a number of cases, to the point where, as of 2015, the 5 nations represent over 3.6 billion people, which is over 41% of the world's population. So obviously, when combined, these are a major player on the global scale. The 5 nations have a combined nominal GDP of US $16.6 trillion, which is roughly 1/4 of the world's world's gross product, and also a combined GDP in terms of PPP of around $37 trillion. So they're significant players here on a global scale, and demonstrates how powerful and important a lot of these transition or emerging economies are becoming. It is interesting, though, recently there has been a bit of debate over the future of these BRICS, and indeed some of the other transition economies as well, because while a lot of them have seen rapid development and growth within the last couple of decades, the GFC hit a lot of them really hard. A lot of them, which were relying on significant changes, were adversely impacted by the GFC. So a number of economists and academics have started to question their long-term growth prospects. But certainly the fact that they've been able to transition and grow so rapidly to this point at least gives hope that moving forward they will continue to be and become even more significant global players.